The horse reared 8 feet in the air, and its front hooves came down an inch from her skull. Guards drew their blades before the animal even landed. Every wolf in that square went dead silent, because 1 second earlier, an Omega, the lowest rank a wolf can hold, had walked up to the Alpha King's warhorse and slapped it across the flank, as a joke, on a dare. She was still laughing when the guards grabbed her arms. Striking the king's stallion carries an automatic death sentence, and she knew that. But Wren Calloway did not beg. She looked the most feared man alive in the eyes and smiled. And his response did not come as a blade. It came as 11 words that destroyed her life and handed her a crown. How does one slap turn an arrogant Omega into a queen? Stay with me on this one. To understand how anyone could be reckless enough to do what Wren did, you have to understand how she grew up. Wren Calloway was an orphan of the Silvercrest pack, way out on the northern border, and by every law of pack hierarchy she should have spent her life at the bottom. Omegas cook. Omegas clean. Omegas lower their eyes when an alpha walks past, and they keep them lowered. That is the order of things, and wolves take the order of things very seriously. But Wren never learned any of that, because when her parents died in a rock slide, Alpha Garrick took the 4-year-old orphan into his own house, not as a servant, as a ward. She was raised in the Alpha's hall, fed at the Alpha's table, and tutored beside the Alpha's own daughter, Ivy. People asked Garrick why over the years, and he always gave the same answer. Her father had pulled him out of a frozen river when they were both young warriors, held him above the ice with 2 broken fingers, and never once mentioned it afterward. A wolf pays that kind of debt, Garrick said, or he is not a wolf. What he never seemed to notice was that he was paying the debt in the wrong currency. He gave the daughter comfort, status, and shelter, everything except the one thing a wolf actually needs, which is to know exactly where she stands. Wren grew up standing nowhere, which felt, from the inside, exactly like standing everywhere. Now here is the thing about growing up protected. You never learn where the edges are. Every time Wren mouthed off to a warrior twice her size, Garrick laughed and called her spirited. Every time she skipped Omega duties, someone else quietly did them for her. When she was 9, she snuck into the warrior's training yard, picked up a practice blade nearly as long as she was, and challenged the weapons master to a duel. He looked to Garrick, waiting for the order to send her to the kitchens. Garrick, watching from the rail, just grinned and said, "Give her 1 round." She lost the round, kept the grin, and learned the lesson underneath the lesson, which was that rules bent for her. When she was 15, she corrected the pack's chronicler on a date in front of the whole hall, and she was right, and Garrick toasted her cleverness while the chronicler sat down with his ears burning. Every one of those moments felt like nothing. Stacked up over 18 years, they built a person. By 22, she was clever, beautiful, quick with her tongue, and absolutely convinced that consequences were things that happened to other people. The other Omegas hated her for it. Believe me, they had reason to. They scrubbed the floors she walked across. They laundered the dresses she wore to a table they served. She was not cruel to them, which somehow made it worse. She simply did not see them, the way you do not see a door that has always opened for you. She once told the pack's beta, to his face, that his battle plan was something a pup could improve. She was right, which made it worse. Wren Calloway walked through the world like a wolf, with an alpha's confidence and an omega's rank, and that is a combination that only survives as long as somebody powerful is standing behind you. And through all of it, 1 step behind her was Ivy, the alpha's actual daughter. They were raised as sisters, and in the daylight they behaved like sisters, and here is the thing nobody in that hall wanted to look at directly. Ivy was the one with the blood, the rank, and the inheritance, and Wren was the one people remembered. Guests asked after the clever ward. Tutors praised the clever ward. Garrick told the river story 100 times, and never once told a story about Ivy. If you want to grow a knife slowly, over 20 years, that is the soil you plant it in. Then, in the spring of her 22nd year, word came north that changed everything. The Alpha King was coming. Cale Ardentis, king of all the packs, was making his first tour of the border territories in 10 years, and Silvercrest was on the route. You have to understand what that name meant to people. Chaol had been crowned at 19, on the worst night in the kingdom's history. They called it the Red Winter. Rogues, they said, broke into the royal den and slaughtered the entire ruling family in a single night. The old king, the queen, Chaol's younger brother, who was 11. Chaol survived only because he was away at the war college. He came home to bodies, took the crown with blood still on the floor, and then spent the next decade becoming the most feared wolf on the continent. He ended 3 border wars. He executed traitors personally. He had never smiled in public. Not once. In 10 years. The stories that reached the border about him had a temperature to them, a coldness people lowered their voices to repeat. That he had walked alone into the Iron Fang Rebellion's war camp and walked out an hour later with the rebellion over and its leader carrying his own banner to the fire. That he heard grievance cases every single week, peasant and noble alike, and had never once been caught in an inconsistency. That he slept 4 hours, 8 standing up, and had refused every one of the 200 noble daughters the great Pax had paraded past his throne. A king with no queen, no heir, no laughter, and no visible wish for any of it. The wolves of Silvercrest said his name the way you talk about winter. Not evil, just coming, whether you like it or not. Silvercrest spent 3 weeks preparing. They repainted the Great Hall, slaughtered half the herds for the feast, and drilled every wolf in protocol until they could bow in their sleep. Garrick grew short-tempered for the first time in Wren's memory, and she understood why when she saw the tax ledgers open on his desk at midnight. A royal visit was an audit with banners, and one rule got repeated more than any other: do not approach the king's horse. This sounds strange until you know the story. Chaol rode a massive black stallion named Onyx, a war horse that had been in the royal family longer than Chaol had been king, and the law was ancient and absolute. The king's mount is the king's body. To strike one is to strike the other. 6 years earlier, a drunk warrior in the Eastern Pax grabbed Onyx's bridle as a stunt during a parade. Chaol had him flogged in front of his entire pack and stripped of his rank, and people whispered that the man got off easy. The pack elders told that story at every meal for 3 weeks, until the pups were reciting it. So when the royal column rode through Silvercrest's gates that morning, banners snapping, 200 royal guards in gray steel, every wolf in the territory knew exactly what not to do. Wren knew too. That is the part that matters. She was not ignorant. She was arrogant, and those are different diseases. Ignorance can be cured with a warning. Arrogance treats the warning as a dare. The ceremony went perfectly. The king dismounted, and the whole pack got its first look at him, and Wren would admit later that even she, who bowed to nothing, felt the air change. He was not what she expected. She had pictured something ornate, a man built out of his own legend. What dismounted was a soldier, plainly dressed under a black cloak, who moved like he was conserving something, and whose eyes went over the assembled pack once, slowly, the way a man checks a room for exits. He accepted Garrick's oath, said maybe 9 words total, and the pack exhaled. Wren, standing in the 3rd row with the household, made the mistake of studying his face during the oath, looking for the monster in it, and found something more unsettling instead. Nothing. A face like a door closed so long the hinges had rusted shut. Then came the feast, and with the feast came wine, and with the wine came Ivy. Ivy, the Alpha's daughter, who had spent 20 years watching an Omega orphan get treated like a princess in her own house. Ivy, who smiled while she resented, the way some people do. Something had happened earlier that day that nobody thought anything of at the time. During the presentation of the household, the royal steward had asked Garrick which of the young women was his daughter, and Garrick, flustered by protocol, had gestured first at Wren before correcting himself. A half-second mistake. Ivy stood there through it, with her court smile on. 20 years, distilled into one gesture at the worst possible moment, in front of the king of the world. If you are looking for the exact place this story becomes a tragedy, it is not the slap. It is that flick of an old man's hand. Out in the courtyard, where Onyx stood tied at the royal post, with the crowd keeping a respectful 30 feet of distance, Ivy leaned close to Wren and said sweetly that it was a shame. A shame that after all her big talk, Wren was scared of a horse just like everyone else. Wren said she was not scared of anything. Ivy said, "Prove it. Touch it." And then Ivy raised the stakes, laughing, loud enough for the other young wolves to hear. "Do not just touch it. Slap it. Give the royal horse a little slap, right on the flank. Unless, of course, the fearless Wren Calloway is actually a coward like the rest of us." A dozen young wolves went quiet, waiting. Somebody giggled nervously, and somebody else whispered that it was death, actual death. And that whisper was the worst thing anyone could have said, because Wren heard it and felt the old familiar certainty rise in her like heat. Death was for other people. Rules were for other people. And Wren, 2 cups of wine deep and 22 years deep in the belief that nothing could ever really touch her, set down her cup. She walked across those 30 feet of open cobblestone with the whole courtyard watching. 30 feet is a long way when a crowd goes silent behind you. She would remember, later, every detail of that walk. The torchlight on the wet stones. The 2 royal guards at the far wall, turned away, arguing about a dice game. The stallion's ear swiveling toward her, tracking her, while the enormous head stayed still. She looked up at 1,700 pounds of black warhorse. Some sliver of her, the last sober sliver, said turn around. She smiled at it, the way she smiled at everything, and she swung her open hand and cracked it across his flank like she was greeting an old friend. You already know what happened next. Onyx screamed and went straight up, hooves punching the air, and came down so close to Wren's head that she felt the wind of it on her face. The royal post tore half out of the ground. Guards came from everywhere at once, blades out, and 2 of them slammed Wren to the cobblestones, while a third fought to control the stallion. The music inside the hall stopped. The crowd stopped. Somewhere behind her a girl was sobbing, and it took Wren a dazed moment, cheek against stone, to realize it was one of the young wolves from the dare, already grieving her. And through the dead silence came footsteps, unhurried even, and the guards holding Wren went pale and pulled her up to her knees, because the Alpha King himself was walking across the courtyard. Cale Ardentis was bigger up close than any man has a right to be. He looked at his horse, still stamping and rolling its eyes. He looked at the Omega kneeling on his guard's hands. The entire pack of Silvercrest was pouring out of the hall behind him, and Garrick's voice was somewhere in it, saying, "Majesty, Majesty, please." And the king did not so much as tilt his head toward the sound. And then he did something no one expected. He waved the guards off, reached down, and closed his hand around Wren's wrist to pull her up himself. The moment his skin touched hers, something happened that neither of them was ready for. If you know werewolf lore, you know the word, mate. Every wolf is born with one perfect match, chosen by the moon herself, and you know them by a single touch. It hits like lightning down the spine. It hits like your own heartbeat answering from inside someone else's chest. Wren gasped out loud, and the Alpha King, the man who had not changed expression in 10 years, went absolutely rigid. For 3 full seconds they stared at each other while the bond roared between them, and Wren watched something move behind the king's eyes. Not joy, fear, then fury. Understand what he was looking at. From inside that rusted door of a face, the moon had just handed the most hunted man alive a mate, which is to say a hostage, a lever, a way in. Everyone he had ever loved had been murdered through the doors love leaves open. Then fury, because the moon had chosen now, here, in a mud street border town, in the shape of a criminal kneeling for the one crime he could not pardon. He leaned down, so close that only she could hear, and he whispered words that felt like a knife going in. "I reject the bond. I reject you. Do you understand me? You do not exist to me." Wren did not understand. Not yet, but her body did. A pain bloomed behind her ribs like something being torn loose, and her knees nearly buckled. She would learn later what a rejected mate bond does to a wolf. Right then, all she knew was that the most powerful man alive had just looked at her like she was a curse. Then Cale straightened up, and in front of her entire pack, he delivered his sentence. 11 words, spoken flat and cold across the silent courtyard. You struck what is mine. So now you are mine too. That was it. No flogging. No execution. Something worse, once people understood it. By royal right, Wren Calloway was stripped from the Silvercrest pack, effective at dawn, and bound into service at the royal stables in the capital. Indefinitely. She would be packless, which for a wolf is a kind of living death. Wolves are not built to be alone. A pack bond hums in the back of a wolf's mind from birth, a low, warm chord of everyone you belong to, and when it is severed, the silence in your own head is said to drive some wolves mad inside a year. She would shovel manure for the animal she slapped, in a city 1,000 miles from everyone she had ever known. And here is the moment that broke something in her. She looked at Garrick, the man who raised her, waiting for him to object, the man who called her spirited for 18 years, who owed her father his life, who had one single moment to spend all that spirit talk like real coin. He looked at the ground. Ivy, who had dared her, melted backward into the crowd and said nothing at all. Wren opened her mouth, and for once in her life, nothing came out. There is a particular education that happens in a single second when a protected person finally finds the edge and finds it 1,000 feet down. That night, they locked her in the grain store to await the column's departure because Silvercrest had no proper cells. One person came, not Garrick, not Ivy. It was Mona, the oldest of the pack's Omegas, a woman Wren had breezed past for 2 decades, who slid a bundle of bread and winter clothes through the door and stood there a moment in the dark. Wren waited for the gloating. Instead, the old woman said, quietly, "Now you will learn what the rest of us always knew, and it is going to hurt, girl, but it might also make you worth something." Then she was gone. Of all the words spoken that day, including the king's, those were the ones Wren would end up carrying longest. She left at dawn in a supply wagon at the tail of the royal column, and nobody came to see her off. 9 days south, chained loosely to a wagon rail like an afterthought, through territories she had only seen on maps. She watched the pine country of her whole life thin out and vanish. She felt her pack bond stretch, fray, and on the 4th night, somewhere at the border of Silvercrest territory, snap, and she bit down on a saddle blanket so the drivers would not hear what that did to her. The drivers, for the record, were not cruel. One of them, a gray-muzzled supply sergeant, shared his flask and told her, unprompted, that he had watched the king for 10 years and had never seen him spare anyone the way she had just been spared, and that she should think hard on what that meant. She thought on it for 500 miles and got nowhere. Then the road crested a ridge, and she got her first look at Thornhold, the capital of every pack in the kingdom. Stone walls, 60 feet high, a city of 40,000 wolves, and rising out of the center of it, the Moon Court, the royal fortress, with towers that caught the light like teeth. The wagon rolled through gates and more gates, each one swallowing her a little deeper, and dropped her at the royal stables, which were bigger than Garrick's entire great hall. A one-eyed old man with a gray beard and forearms like ship rope looked her up and down. His name was Fenwick, master of the king's stables for 30 years. He handed her a shovel, and he said the first honest thing anyone had said to her in weeks. "In here, girl. Nobody cares who raised you. The horses decide what you're worth. Start shoveling." So she shoveled. Let me tell you what those first weeks did to Wren Calloway, because it matters for everything that comes after. In Silvercrest, she had been somebody. In Thornhold, she was furniture. Court wolves looked straight through her. Nobles she held gates for did not know she existed. She hauled water before sunrise, mucked 40 stalls, ate standing up, and slept in a bunk room over the tack house that smelled like leather and old hay. Her hands, which had never done a full day's labor, blistered, burst, bled, and finally hardened, and there was a morning in the 2nd week when she stood looking at her own palms like they belonged to a stranger. She tried, exactly once, the old Silvercrest trick of talking her way out of a chore, informing a senior groom with her best smile that hauling the manure sledge was clearly a 2-person job. The groom, a broad, silent woman named Petra, looked at her for a moment and then simply walked away and let the sledge sit there, Nobody did it for her. Nobody had ever not done it for her. The sledge sat in the aisle for 3 hours like a monument, until Wren hauled it herself, alone, in the rain, and something in her chest ground painfully against something else and shifted, just slightly, like a bone starting to set. The arrogance did not die all at once. It died the way a fire dies, one cold morning at a time. And underneath it, something else was growing. The pain behind her ribs, the one that started when the king whispered those words, was not going away. It was getting worse. There was one wolf in that whole stone city who was kind to her from the first day, and he was 4.5 feet tall. Tam was 11, an Omega orphan of the city, all elbows and cowlick, who had been taken on by Fenwick to fetch and carry the way Fenwick apparently collected strays. Tam attached himself to Wren the first week, partly because she was the only person lower on the ladder than he was, and mostly, she suspected, because she was from the wild north and he wanted stories. She gave him stories. He gave her the stable's entire hidden map, which grooms took 8 years to learn, which cook could be charmed, which corridor the stewards used when they did not want to be seen, which loft plank lifted up if a person needed to stash bread for a bad day. She caught herself, one evening, teaching him letters in the dust of the feed-room floor with a stick, the way she had been taught in an alpha's hall with ink and vellum, and had to stop for a moment because of the tightness in her throat. Remember Tam. He is small, and this story is large, but the large parts of this story turn on the small ones. Now, about the horse. Onyx had his own wing of the stable, and Wren quickly learned that her punishment had a punchline. The stallion was unmanageable, not spirited, dangerous. He had put 2 grooms in the infirmary that year alone. He shredded lead ropes, kicked through boards, and would not let a single living soul touch him except the king himself. Fenwick fed him by sliding buckets through a gap in the rails, like feeding a prisoner. The grooms had a rule, unwritten but absolute, that you did not walk his aisle without announcing yourself from the doorway, and even then you kept a stall's width of distance, and this was the animal Wren was assigned to serve. The first time she entered his wing, he pinned his ears, bared his teeth, and hit the stall door so hard the hinges sang. She dropped the water bucket and ran. Somewhere behind her, she was sure, the moon herself was laughing. But here is the thing about Wren. Stripped of everything else, the stubbornness stayed. It was the one part of the arrogance that turned out to be load-bearing. She started sitting outside that stall on an overturned bucket during her breaks, just sitting there, talking. About Silvercrest, about Ivy, about how much she hated the king, which was a long topic, and one she noticed the stallion seemed to have opinions about, because his ears would swivel back at the king's name and stay there. Days of this. Weeks. The other grooms thought she had cracked. Petra started leaving a second bucket by the aisle door without comment. Cam sat with her sometimes, at a safe distance, whispering that his friends in the city would never believe him. The stallion ignored her, then watched her, then began, she realized one day with a jolt, positioning himself at whichever end of the stall was closest to her bucket. And then one evening in her 6th week, while she was mid-sentence complaining about the cook, Onyx walked to the rails, put his huge black head over the top, and breathed into her hair. Wren went very still. Every horse sense instinct the stable had drilled into her said back away slowly. She had never once obeyed an instinct in her life. Then, slowly, she raised her hand, the same hand, and laid it flat on his cheek, and the most dangerous horse in the kingdom closed his eyes. Fenwick was standing at the end of the aisle with a grain sack frozen halfway to his shoulder, staring like he was watching water burn. That night Fenwick poured her a cup of the bitter stable tea and told her what she had actually slapped. Onyx was not just the king's horse. He was bred and gentled by the old queen herself, Cale's mother, the finest horsewoman the court had ever seen. She had raised him from a leggy black foal that no one else saw promise in, fed him from her own hand, trained him with patience instead of the whip, and when he was grown she gave him to her husband, which the court poets made much of. He had been the old king's mount for 9 years. He had carried the boy princes on his back at a walk, both of them at once, gentle as a nursemaid, while the queen led him around the yard, And on the night of the Red Winter, 10 years ago, when the guards finally broke into the royal grounds, they found the stables burned, every horse dead or scattered, except one, Onyx, cut and bleeding, standing in the courtyard over the old king's body, refusing to let anyone near it. It took 6 men in a cattle net, Fenwick said, and the horse screamed the whole time, and Fenwick said he had heard wolves die and men die, and had never heard anything like it. He had fought for his family. He was the only one who had. Since that night, he had let exactly one person touch him, the surviving son. And now, apparently, you, Fenwick said, and looked at her with his one eye for a long moment. Whatever you are to that animal, girl, you had better take it seriously. She started taking a lot of things seriously, because her body gave her no choice. By the 3rd month, the pain behind her ribs had become fevers, night sweats, mornings when her hands shook so badly she dropped the pitchfork. She hid it, because hiding weakness was the one Silvercrest lesson that translated, and she might have gone on hiding it if her body had cooperated. It did not. She finally collapsed in the feed room, and it was Tam who found her and ran shrieking down the aisle, and Fenwick who carried her to the stable healer. And the stable healer, an old Omega woman named Sarah, with kind hands and eyes that had seen every kind of damage a court can do, who examined her, went quiet, and then asked one question. Child, who rejected you? And that is when Wren learned the whole truth of what happened in that courtyard. The lightning in her wrist had been the mate bond. The moon had tied her, an orphan Omega, to Cale Ardentis himself. And a rejected bond does not just hurt. It festers. Sarah explained it the way you explain a wound to a soldier, plainly, because the plainness is the kindness. The bond, once touched, is a living channel between 2 wolves. Completed, it becomes the deepest strength either will ever know. Rejected, it becomes an open vein. It drains a wolf slowly, over months, fevers first, then the shaking, then the long sleeps, sometimes to death. There was no herb for it. There were only 2 cures, and both were words in the mouth of the one who spoke the rejection. Revoke it, or watch it finish. Both wolves, the healer said. Rejection cuts the one who speaks it just as deep. Somewhere in that fortress, the Alpha King was sick too, hiding it behind 10 years of practice at hiding everything. Wren lay on that cot doing the math, and the fury that filled her was almost a relief, because fury at least was warm. He had known. In those 3 seconds in the courtyard, he had felt exactly what she felt, known exactly what she was to him, the one companion the moon herself had made for him, and he had leaned down and thrown it away like spoiled meat, and then sentenced her to live within a mile of him while it killed them both. Sarah made her drink something bitter and said one more thing before she let her sleep. In 40 years, child, I have known the moon to be cruel, and I have known her to be strange, but I have never once known her to be careless. If she tied you to that man, she wanted you in this fortress. I would try to be worth the trouble. She got her chance to be trouble, because of a detail she had noticed and told no one. The king could not sleep. 2 or 3 nights a week, long past midnight, Cale Ardentis came down to the stables alone, no guards, no crown, and stood at Onyx's stall in the dark. She had watched him from the loft the first time, certain she was about to witness some secret cruelty, and had instead watched the most feared wolf alive stand motionless for an hour, with his forehead almost touching the stall rail, saying nothing, while the stallion stood with him. It was the posture of a man visiting a grave. She had always hidden when she heard him. One night in the 4th month, fresh off Sarah's cot, and burning with what she now knew, she did not hide. He rounded the corner and found his rejected mate standing in the lantern light with her arms crossed, and to his credit, he did not pretend not to know her. They stood 10 feet apart while the bond pulled at both of them like a rope neither would touch. She could see it now, knowing what to look for. The weight loss under the soldier's frame, the shadow at his temples. The court thought their king was carved from stone, and stone does not sweat at 2 in the morning. She asked him if it hurt. He said nothing. She said, "Good." And the king of every wolf alive took that from an Omega with hay in her hair, took it without a word, and left. but he came back 2 nights later, and 2 nights after that. That is how it started. Not romance. Believe me, it was nothing so soft. It was 2 people circling the same wound. Bit by bit, across those midnight visits, she learned the man behind the title. He talked to the horse, not to her. But she was allowed to be there, and that itself was strange power. No one in the kingdom was allowed to be there. She learned the scar on his jaw was from the War College, from the night he got the news about his family and put his fist through a window, and that he had set the bones of his own hand himself, rather than tell the college healer why. She learned he remembered his mother mostly in this stable, because the throne room memories had all been painted over by blood, and that the smell of the tack oil his mother had favored was still made up, on his standing order, by an apothecary in the lower city, though the queen was 10 years gone. He said all of this to Onyx in a low voice, in fragments weeks apart, while Wren mended tack in the lantern light and pretended not to be the entire reason he was talking out loud. Once, only once in those months, she pushed too far. She asked him, flat out, why a man would reject the one thing the moon builds for every wolf. The stall went quiet. When he finally answered, he answered the horse, not her. He said that everyone who had ever had a claim on his heart had been murdered for standing close to it, and that he had spent 10 years making sure there was nothing left in him worth aiming at, and that the moon had no right to undo 10 years of amputation with one touch in a border courtyard. Then he left without another word, and did not come back for 9 days, and Wren spent those 9 nights learning that anger and understanding can live in the same chest, and that the second one hurts more. And one night after he returned, he finally said something directly to her. He asked why Onyx allowed her. She said maybe the horse liked wolves who did not grovel. It was the first time she saw it happen. The corner of the king's mouth moved. Not a smile. The ghost of where a smile used to live. He killed it immediately, but she saw it. Meanwhile, above her head, the moon court was moving. The royal chancellor, a silver-templed beta named Alistair Vane, had served the crown since the old king's day, and he had one great project. The king must marry. Specifically, he must marry Lady Mara Blackthorn of the Blood Moon Pack, whose father, Lord Cassius, controlled the eastern border and half the kingdom's silver mines. The chancellor argued it in council with unassailable patience. An unwed king with no heir was an invitation. The eastern packs were restless. The mines funded the army. It was all true, which is the mark of a really first-class liar, that he almost never has to lie. Wren learned the court's shape second-hand and sideways, the way servants do, through Tam's gossip network of kitchen boys, and through what nobles said over her head while she held their horses, nobles being wolves who would check a mirror for eavesdroppers before they would check an omega. The betrothal would be sealed at the blood moon ceremony at summer's end. Wren saw the chancellor up close exactly once that season, and it was once too many. He came down to the stables on a routine inspection, all silver temples and warm eyes, and he stopped in front of her, which chancellors do not do, and told her, gently, that she was the young lady from the northern incident, was she not, and that she should not think her circumstances beneath notice, because nothing in this court was beneath his notice. Then he complimented Fenwick on the condition of the tack, patted Tam on the head, and swept out. It was, by every visible measure, kindness. It stayed with her for days, the way a cold draft stays in a room, and she could not have told you why. Fenwick could have. Fenwick watched the chancellor's party leave and spat, very quietly, into the straw. She saw Lady Mara exactly once that season too, when the court came down to view the famous royal stallion. Mara was beautiful the way frost is beautiful, and came flanked by ladies and guards and her father, Lord Cassius, a wide gray slab of a soldier who looked at the royal stables the way a man looks at a property he is planning to bid on. Myra reached out one gloved hand toward Onyx's stall, and the stallion snapped at her fast enough that her guards yanked her back with her glove torn. There was a frozen little silence, and then Mara laughed prettily and said what a fierce creature, and only Wren, watching from the hayloft, saw the look Mara gave her own father in that moment. It was not embarrassment. It was something closer to told you so. Wren, up in the dusty dark, decided the horse was a fine judge of character. Remember that. The horse is a fine judge of character. A letter came for Wren that same week. The first and only letter of her exile, travel-stained from 1,000 miles. It was from Ivy, 4 pages of a hand she knew as well as her own, and it said, in essence, nothing. News of the pack, the weather in the north, a foal born to the gray mare Wren had liked. Not one word about the courtyard, the dare, the wine, the silence. It was signed, your sister, Ivy. Wren read it 3 times, held the corner of it to the lantern flame, and then did not burn it, and could not have said why. She put it under her mattress in the bunk room. Remember where she put it. She thought about the last look on Ivy's face for a long time that night, and about Mona's bread, and about how many kinds of guilt there were, and which kinds ripen into something, and which kinds just rot. Then came the night of the colic. Wren woke at 2 in the morning to a sound she had learned to dread, a horse going down heavy, and found Onyx, sweating, biting at his own sides, trying to roll in his stall. Colic kills horses, and it kills them fast, and it kills them cruelly, the gut twisting on itself while the animal, not understanding, tries to roll away from a pain that is inside it. The remedy is brutal and simple. Keep them up. Keep them walking. Do not let them roll, hour after hour, no matter how tired they are, no matter how tired you are. She could have sent for Fenwick and gone back to bed. It was not her shift. It was, by any measure the stable kept, not her problem. Instead, she sent Tam running for Fenwick, and then went into the stall, into the killing range of a delirious warhorse, because standing outside, it had become unthinkable at some point in the past months, without her noticing. She spent 7 hours in there, walking him when he could stand, hauling on his head with her whole body weight when he tried to go down, holding his head when he could not stand, and standing on his lead so he could not roll, telling him he was not allowed to die because he was the only one in this cursed city who liked her, and because his dead queen had not fought that whole night 10 years ago just for him to lose to a stomachache. Fenwick and Sarah came and dosed him, and the 3 of them and one terrified 11-year-old traded shifts on the lead until gray light. By dawn, the worst had passed. Sarah said afterward that the dosing saved the horse's body, but that the first 2 hours, before they arrived, were the hours that mattered, and those had belonged to Wren alone. And when Cale came down that morning and slid open the stall door, he found his warhorse sleeping nose to nose with a shivering Omega who had refused to leave. He stood there a long time. Then he took off his own cloak, the black one with the royal crest, and laid it over her, and walked out without waking her. Fenwick saw it. Fenwick, who had served 3 kings, said later he nearly dropped his coffee. The consequence came within the week, and it turned heads all over the court. By royal order, the Omega Wren Calloway was named personal groom to the king's stallion, an appointment nobles had begged for as an honor for their own children. Chancellor Alistair objected in council, on the record, that elevating the very criminal who assaulted the royal mount made a mockery of the law. The king overruled him in 1 sentence. The chancellor smiled, bowed, and let it go. But here is a lesson worth keeping. In a court, the man who smiles when he loses is the one you watch, because what the chancellor had actually just learned, in that council chamber, was that the king could be moved. 10 years of watching a stone door, and someone had finally shown him the hinge. From that day, Wren noticed, without quite noticing that she noticed, that she saw the same faces near the stables more often. A steward, with nothing to steward. A guard whose rotation never rotated. A court that had looked straight through her had begun, very quietly, to look at her. She was 4 months out of Silvercrest and did not yet have the education to know what that meant. And then, for a little while, life simply got quiet. I want you to sit in the quiet with her for a moment, because she had earned it, and because of what comes after. Wren woke at 5, and liked the cold air on the walk to the feed room. Onyx nickered at her footsteps every morning, the same 2 notes, like a greeting. Fenwick started calling her girl the way other people said granddaughter, and started, too, teaching her things beyond a groom's station, the reading of a horse's mood at 40 paces, the histories of the bloodlines, the ledgers, the way you speak to a farrier versus a feed merchant, all of it delivered gruffly, as if it were her fault he had decided to pour 30 years into her. Tam learned his letters all the way through and wrote his own name on the feed room wall, where, as far as I know, it still is. The fevers even eased when the king lingered near the stables, which he did more and more, and if his eyes found hers over the stallion's back and stayed there a beat too long, well, nobody official was counting. Sarah was counting. Sarah said nothing and adjusted her tonics and watched the two of them the way old women watch weather they have seen before. For the first time since the slap, Wren Calloway went to sleep without bracing for tomorrow. Then, on an ordinary gray Tuesday, she pulled down the old ceremonial saddle blanket to mend a torn seam, and a needle of pure silver fell out of the lining and rang on the stone floor. Everything that follows starts with that sound, because this was not a needle. It was a barb, 2 inches long, socketed in a leather plug, positioned in the blanket to sit directly over the stallion's spine, angled so that the weight of a rider would drive it in. Silver, to a creature raised around wolves, is fire. Wren stood there with the thing in her palm, while the whole horrible shape of it assembled in her head. This was the blanket Onyx wore on ceremony days. He had worn it once since she arrived. On the day of her slap, she had cracked her hand across his flank, and he had exploded, and everyone, including her, had believed it was the slap. A war-trained stallion who had stood calm through battles did not explode from a slap. He exploded because her strike shifted the blanket and raked silver across his spine, and if she had not done it, the barb would have waited for the moment it was built for. The moment the Alpha King swung his weight into the saddle for the parade, in a packed square, on a horse driven insane by burning metal. Her stupid, arrogant, drunken joke had ripped an assassination apart by accident, which meant somebody in this fortress had built one. Understand what changed in that feed room. This was no longer a story about an Omega's punishment and a king's pride. Somebody inside the Moon Court wanted Cale Ardentis dead, had wanted it for months, and was still here, and the only person who knew was the one wolf in the kingdom with a criminal record for attacking his horse. She sat down on a grain barrel with the barb wrapped in a rag in her fist and made herself think it through the way Fenwick had taught her to read a lame horse, slowly, symptom by symptom, before touching anything. Who could reach a locked blanket? Who benefited from a dead king? Who could be sure the death would look like an animal's madness and not a blade's work? Every answer pointed up, into the court, into rooms she would never enter, and the old Wren, the Silvercrest Wren, would have marched up the fortress steps that hour and announced her brilliance to the first noble she found. The new Wren understood something that would keep her alive through everything that followed. A secret is only a weapon while nobody knows you are holding it. She went to Fenwick, because Fenwick had one eye and saw more than anyone. The old man turned the barb over in his scarred fingers, and his face went gray. Then he did something she did not expect. He barred the tack room door. The ceremonial equipment, he told her, was kept locked. 3 keys. His own, never off his belt, and he pulled it out and showed her, as if he needed her to check him off the list, which, she realized with a small shock, he did. The captain of the Royal Guards, and the Chancellor's office key, held for inspections. Then he sat down slowly on a grain barrel and told her the thing he had swallowed for 10 years. Fenwick had been there the morning after the Red Winter. He was the one who found Onyx standing over the old king, and he had never believed the rogue story. Rogues do not pass 60 guards without one alarm raised. Rogues do not know which corridor the queen takes at midnight. Rogues do not fire the stables first, which is not a raider's move, but an assassin's, because the stables held the fastest way to carry a warning out. That night had smelled like the inside all along, he said. But grief needs a simple enemy, and the whole kingdom chose the simple one, and the one old man who kept saying otherwise got called broken by sorrow until he learned to say it only to horses. If someone inside is reaching for the crown again, girl, then this was never 2 attacks. It is 1 attack, 10 years long. They agreed on caution, and for a week they practiced it. Fenwick quietly inventoried every piece of ceremonial tack on invented pretexts. Wren watched the aisle traffic and kept a list in her head of every soul who passed the tack room, and it was on that watch that she noticed the steward with nothing to steward again, twice, and told Fenwick, and Fenwick wrote a name in the ledger margin in his cramped hand. Tam, who missed nothing and understood more than either of them wanted him to, took to sleeping in the loft above the tack room with a horn whistle on a string around his neck, and refused all orders to stop. Getting to the king was harder than it sounds, because a groom does not request an audience, and a written message would pass through 6 hands, any one of which might be the wrong hands. But Wren had one channel no chancellor controlled. She waited for the midnight visit. When Cale came to the stall, she put the silver barb in his hand and talked for 10 straight minutes. Dates, seams, keys, the physics of a rider's weight, everything, and watched the Alpha King turn to stone in front of her. He did not want to believe it. You could see the want. Believing it meant the walls he had bled to build had a door in them, had always had a door in them, and that the door had a familiar face. But he was a soldier before he was a king, so he tested it. He asked her the questions a soldier asks, and she had answers, because she had spent a week being taught by a one-eyed man to have them. The next night, 3 people, the king, the Omega, and the one-eyed stable master, quietly went through every piece of ceremonial tack in the royal collection, by lantern light, with the doors barred, the king of all wolves kneeling in the straw working seams with his own knife, and in the hunt saddle, the one prepared and waiting for the royal betrothal hunt 2 weeks away, they found the second barb. Fresh leather, new stitching, placed within the month. Wren watched the last doubt leave him, and something colder arrive. He looked at her across that saddle and said, quietly, that she had now saved his life twice, once by accident and once on purpose, and that he was beginning to think the moon had a sense of humor. The hunt was cancelled the next morning. The kingdom was told the king had a fever, and for one night, standing in a locked tack room with a murder plot laid out on the table between them, his hand came up and almost touched her face. If you're still with me, hit that subscribe button, because this is exactly the halfway mark, and what this court does to her next is the reason I wanted to tell this story. The enemy learned everything within a day, which told you everything about how deep the enemy sat. A cancelled hunt, a king's fever, a lantern burning late in a barred tack room. Any one of those alone was nothing, and someone in that fortress had a mind that never received nothing without weighing it. And the counterstrike was beautiful, in the way a trap is beautiful, because it did not defend. It reversed. Guards searched the stable dormitory on an anonymous tip, and in Wren's bunk, sewn into her mattress, they found a pouch of silver filings that matched the barbs. They found a purse of blood moon minted coin she could never have earned. And they found a letter, in a hand that was not hers but close enough, addressed to a contact in the East, complaining that the first attempt on the horse had failed, and promising the hunt would finish it. And here is the detail that told Wren, even shaking in her chains, that she was fighting somebody of real quality. The forged letter's hand was close enough to hers to convince a court, because somebody had possessed a sample of her writing to copy, and there was exactly one piece of her writing in the entire capital. Ivy's letter, from under that same mattress, was gone. Read the design. Whoever built this had turned her own miracle inside out. Her slap was no longer the accident that saved the king. It was repackaged as the first assassination attempt, and Wren Calloway had been publicly punished for touching that horse in front of 1,000 witnesses. The story wrote itself. Motive, even. Revenge for her exile. She was arrested in the feed aisle before breakfast, in front of the horses, and the ones doing the arresting were royal guards with faces she knew, and one of them, a young one she had shared night shift tea with, would not meet her eyes, and somehow that was the detail that made it real. Onyx heard her voice change, and came apart in his wing, screaming and hammering the boards, and the last thing she saw of the stable was Fenwick, held back at the aisle door by 2 guards, not struggling, watching everything with his one eye like a man taking inventory for later. Tam she did not see at all, and that was the single mercy of the morning, because Tam was where nobody thought to look, flat in the hayloft over the dormitory, having watched, 2 nights earlier, a steward with nothing to steward carry a bundle into the bunk room at an hour when honest wolves are asleep. He was 11, and he was terrified, and he had no idea yet that what was in his head mattered. Hold on to that. Here is the part that cut deepest. Cale let them take her, understand his position, even if she could not, chained in that moment. The evidence was physically real. The council had voted. The bond between them was secret, and if he shielded a low-born Omega against treason evidence with no explanation, the Chancellor's faction would smell the reason inside a week, and a rejected mate bond was a weapon they would drive straight through his throne, and through her heart first, because the fastest way to cripple a bonded alpha has never been to attack the alpha. He needed time to hunt the traitor, and the only way to buy it was to look like a man who did not care. So the king of all packs stood at the top of the stairs and watched his own mate dragged across the courtyard in silver-lined shackles, and said nothing, and she looked up at him exactly once. Whatever was left of the girl who trusted people, that look was where it died. He stood there and received it. That look, the way soldiers receive wounds they have decided are the cost of the position, and only 2 beings in the fortress could have testified to what it did to him. One was a horse, the other was Sarah, who was summoned to the king's chambers that night for his fever, and found him sitting in the dark, and was wise enough to treat him without asking a single question. They gave her a trial date with theater in mind. She would be judged at the Blood Moon ceremony before every assembled alpha in the kingdom. The same night the betrothal to Lady Myra would be blessed. Order restored, alliance sealed, criminal condemned, all under one moon. The Chancellor argued for it in council as efficiency and called it mercy, a quick end instead of a long rot in the cells. And you can measure the man by the fact that he had convinced most of the council he was the prisoner's best friend in the room. And to hammer the coffin shut, the prosecution produced a character witness from the north. Alpha Garrick of Silvercrest walked into the Moon Court, the man who had raised her, and testified in advance deposition that his former ward had always been arrogant, always resentful of authority, always believed herself above the law. Every word technically true, every word a knife. That is the devil's favorite recipe, nothing but true ingredients, arranged into a lie. He never once looked toward the cells. What Wren could not know, and what would not have comforted her anyway, was what it had taken to get him there. The quiet letters reminding him whose signature sat on Silvercrest's unresolved tax audit. The suggestion that a pack that raised a traitor might be examined for treason of its own. Garrick had spent one night with the choice and chosen his pack over his ward, and some wolves will tell you that is even the right choice, that a pack is 500 souls and a ward is 1. Maybe. But he did not make it like a man choosing sadly among duties. He made it like a man grateful for the excuse. Ivy came with him, and Ivy did look, one long look through the bars, and Wren saw something in her old friend's face that she filed away. Not triumph. Guilt, the kind that has been growing for a while. And something else, newer. Ivy's eyes went once, quickly, to the guard beside the cell door, and then back, and it took Wren a moment to understand that Ivy was afraid, and not of the guard's blade, of being seen looking. Even the visitors in this fortress were performing for someone. The cell was granite, the bars silver cord, and the rejection sickness came off its leash entirely, because whatever nearness had been easing it was gone. Fevers stacked on fevers. She lost days she could not account for. She talked to Onyx in the dark, out loud, the habit of months, and if you think she felt foolish doing it, you have never been alone the way she was alone. And on the 4th night, Fenwick bribed his way in with the healer and brought news that reframed everything. The king had collapsed in council that morning. Actually collapsed, in front of the full council, mid-sentence, caught by his own guard captain before he hit the table. The court blamed grief and fever. The Chancellor, Fenwick said grimly, had been magnificent, taking charge of the king's care, filtering his visitors, his documents, his food, for the king's own protection, and every wolf in the fortress was praising the old man's devotion. Fenwick, who knew what she knew, understood it plainly. The bond was eating them both now, and Cale was carrying it alone in a fortress full of knives, and the head of the knives had just been handed the sick-room door. Sarah was fighting for access and losing. Fenwick had one thing to say before the guards moved him along, and he said it through the bars in a whisper. "Eat everything they give you, sleep when you can, and stay alive, girl. Breathing is winning. Everything else can be taken back later, but only by the living." But it was what Wren heard through her own cell wall that turned fear into countdown. 2 guards, night shift, low voices, one complaining about crates from the east being moved through the cellars, wine for the ceremony, except heavy as ore, and stacked in the old passage under the great hall that nobody used, and why store wine where no steward goes, and the other laughing, saying not to worry about the count, because after the blood moon there would be a new hand signing the ledgers anyway. A new hand. She sat in the dark with her fever and put the pieces in a row. The barbs, the frame job, blood moon coin, blood moon crates in the cellars, a king collapsing on schedule, his food and drink filtered by devoted hands, a ceremony that would gather the king, weakened and half poisoned by a broken bond, in one hall with every pack alpha as witnesses, because that was the genius of it, the witnesses. You do not need to hide a king's death if every leader in the kingdom watches him die of visible illness and then watches the loyal chancellor, heartbroken, hold the realm together. They had stopped trying to make his death look like an accident. They were going to make it look like a coronation. Her last visitor before the ceremony was the one she least expected. Lady Mara Blackthorne came down to the cells alone, silk hem dragging through straw dust, and stood outside the bars, studying Wren like a problem on a page. For a moment, nothing. Then Mara said a strange thing. She said that when she was a girl, her father used to disappear for winters and come back with royal gossip he should never have known, and that the winter she was 9, he came back with a scar and a new signet ring, and their pack's debts paid. And that was the winter the royal family died, and that the smartest thing a woman in her family ever learned was when not to ask questions. She said she had been not asking questions her whole life, and that it was a kind of work, actually, harder than it looked, and lately she found herself very tired. "Tomorrow," Mayra said, "whatever happens in that hall, kneel early and keep your head down, because my father rewards obedience and punishes everything else." Then she pulled her furs around her and left without waiting for a reply, her guards falling in at the stair. Wren sat back against the granite and understood 2 things. Lord Cassius Blackthorne was in it up to his teeth, and had been since the Red Winter, and his own daughter was warning the accused in the only sideways language she had, which meant even the conspirators' children were afraid of what tomorrow was. Rescue came 4 hours before moonrise, and it came shaped like an old man with one eye. Fenwick appeared at the cell door with the guard's keys in his fist and blood on his knuckles, and behind him the corridor was suspiciously quiet, and behind him also, to Wren's horror, was Tam, white-faced and vibrating and proud, because the whole thing had been threaded through gaps only a stable boy knew existed, and because it was Tam, finally, terror and all, who had come to Fenwick 2 days before and told him about the steward and the bundle in the bunk room and turned an old man's suspicion into an old man's certainty. Fenwick unlocked her shackles with hands that did not shake and talked while he worked. He had served the old king since before Cale was born. He had spent 10 years being told that his gut about the Red Winter was an old man's grief. Tonight, either they proved it or they died trying. And dying trying beat dying quiet. The guards on this level had been dosed with Sarah's sleeping draught in their shift tea, which Sarah would deny to her grave, and which is why you should never underestimate old women with kind hands. He had one more thing to tell her, and it was bad. Her evidence, the second barb and the tack room ledger with its inspection signatures, had been seized from the king's own study 2 days ago, which meant the chancellor's people could enter the king's rooms at will, which meant Cale was already inside the cage, sick, guarded by his enemies, and due in the great hall within hours to be publicly finished. But Fenwick, being Fenwick, had kept back what nobody thought to seize. The first barb never left his boot, and the stall gate was already open. There was no saddle, there was no time. There was one moment, in the stable aisle, that mattered more than it looked. Wren stood in front of Onyx, who had not been ridden by any living soul but the king in 10 years, and she did not grab his mane and scramble. She stood there, one breath, and asked, out loud, like a fool, like a girl who had talked to this animal for the better part of a year. "Will you carry me?" And the great black horse who had carried kings knelt his forequarters down like a battle mount, the way the old queen had trained him a lifetime ago, and every groom watching from the aisle doors swore to it afterward, and I believe them. Ren came out of the stable doors on Onyx's bare back with her fists in his mane, and he ran that night like the red winter itself was behind him. Through the service gate Fenwick had unbarred, up the processional road, through market crowds that screamed and parted, sparks off the cobbles, guards diving sideways. A mounted patrol tried to close the lantern bridge, and Onyx went through the gap between their horses at a full gallop, a gap I am telling you was not wide enough, and left both patrol mounts spinning, and neither rider unseated, because even at war speed he was precise. He had been made by the finest horsewoman the court ever saw, and he had been waiting 10 years for a night that required everything. Understand the picture the city saw. The royal stallion, the sacred untouchable animal of the crown, thundering through Thornhold with a condemned Omega on his back, heading straight for the moon court. Some fell to their knees. Wolves are believers, deep down, and a horse that would kill any hand but the king's, carrying a traitor like she was made of glass, did not look like an escape. It looked like a sign. Inside the great hall, the blood moon ceremony was already curdling. 1,000 wolves, every alpha in the kingdom. The moon bleeding red through the glass roof. Kale stood at the dais rail, gray-faced, sweat at his temples, one hand gripping the rail harder than a healthy king grips anything, because the ceremonial wine was in him, and the wolfsbane in the wine was doing its work, layered dose on dose across days of devoted care, timed to crest tonight. Chancellor Alistair stood at his shoulder, solicitous, steadying, the picture of loyalty, timing his coup by the color of the king's face. He had already, an hour before, positioned the evening's narrative with a few sorrowful words to key alphas about the king's failing health and the burdens of continuity. Lord Cassius watched from the front rank with his soldiers salted through the crowd in guest colors, 40 of them, placed across 3 months of guest lists. Lady Mara stood beside her father in bridal silver, looking at nothing. The plan was minutes from harvest, and then the doors of the great hall exploded inward, and 1,700 pounds of royal warhorse came up the center aisle with Ren Calloway on his back, and 1,000 alphas learned that night what a room full of screaming leadership sounds like. She did not wait for permission. She had learned court manners the hard way and decided against them. From Onyx's back, in the stunned half-second before the guards could act, she held up the silver barb and shouted the whole thing into the vaulted ceiling. The rigged blanket, the rigged hunt saddle, the tack room keys, and who held them, the planted coin, the forged letter, the stolen page it was forged from, the wine crates in the cellar heavy as ore, and she told them where, the old passage under this very hall, under their feet as they stood there. Go and look. She named the Chancellor, and she named Lord Cassius, and she told 1,000 wolves that the Red Winter had never been rogues, that the same rot had been feeding inside this court for 10 years, and it was standing on the dais right now with its hand on their poisoned king. Test the wine, she shouted. Test the king's cup. It is still on the rail. For one heartbeat, the hall teetered. Alistair laughed, silken, unhurried, and you had to admire the nerve of it, and called it the raving of a condemned animal thief, a mad woman who had now added horse theft and blasphemy to treason, and gestured almost lazily for the guards, and reminded the hall with gentle sorrow that this was precisely the instability he had warned the council of. It might have held. Court words usually beat stable words, but 3 things broke his spell, one after another, like locks opening. Fenwick came through the shattered doors with the guard captain at his side, and the captain's own ledger in his fist, shouting that the tack room inspection seals had been forged with the Chancellor's cipher, and the sight of the guard captain, the 3rd key, standing with the accused, moved 100 hands away from 100 sword hilts. Then a pack alpha of the Western Mountains, an old bull with no patience for theater, simply walked out of the crowd, picked up the king's cup from the rail, and held it out toward the Chancellor with one raised eyebrow, and said, "If it is only raving, drink." And Cale Ardentis, swaying, poisoned, gripped the rail and spoke his first full sentence of the ceremony, and the hall stopped breathing to hear it. He said, "Test my cup." And then, into the silence, looking at the chancellor with 10 years of rusted hinges tearing open, he said the sentence that turned the hall, the one the songs kept. "You filtered everything that reached me, old friend. My food, my letters, my family. 10 years ago." Alistair's eyes flicked to Cassius, and Cassius, being a soldier and not a courtier, made the soldier's choice. He drew steel and shouted the signal, and 40 Blood Moon fighters in guest colors pulled blades, and the Blood Moon ceremony became a battlefield. What happened in the next 10 minutes became 3 different songs, and none of them exaggerate. Chaol shifted on the dais steps, and even poisoned, the Alpha King's wolf was a black monster half again the size of any wolf in that hall, and he met Blood Moon's vanguard like a landslide. Loyal guards rallied to him. Pack alphas who had come as wedding guests shifted where they stood, because whatever they thought of their king, watching a chancellor try to steal a throne clarifies a wolf's politics fast. Onyx fought too, and this the songs did not have to invent. A warhorse in a packed hall wheeling and striking, guarding Ren's back like a wall with hooves. And there are alphas alive today who will tell you the most frightening thing in that room was not the king, but the wolfsbane was patient. Ren saw it from Onyx's back, saw the king's charge slow, saw the great black wolf stumble on the steps, with 3 fighters closing in, and she did the arithmetic of her own body, the fevers, the fading, the bond dying at both ends, and she understood with total clarity that there was exactly one medicine in this hall for what was killing him, the bond itself. She slid off the stallion into the chaos and fought her way to the dais with a dropped spear used mostly as a bar, and Fenwick fought his way behind her with a hayhook, 60 years old and roaring, and reached him as he went down to one knee in his human shape again, blood at his mouth. His eyes found hers, and Chaol Ardentis, in the middle of a battle for his crown, with the poison winning, used what breath he had for the only words that mattered. "I, Chaol Ardentis, take it back. I revoke my rejection. I claim the bond. I claim you. If you will have a fool," she said yes. Actually, what she said was, "You are the stupidest man the moon ever crowned." And yes, and the bond snapped closed. There are wolves who were in that hall, who swear the red moonlight brightened. What is certain is what everyone saw. The dying king stood up. The rejection sickness, months of it, both directions, burned off like fog, and the strength the bond had been bleeding out of both of them came flooding back through the open channel, hers into him, his into hers. The wolfsbane did not vanish, but it had been killing a halved man, and it was suddenly fighting a whole one with his mate at his back. Chaol shifted again and hit Cassius Blackthorn's line like the Red Winter's own debt collector. It was not close. Lord Cassius went down under the king's jaws in front of the alphas he had planned to rule, and with him went the spine of the coup. Blood Moon fighters threw down blades in heaps, and Lady Mayra, in her bridal silver, stepped over her father's body, walked to the nearest loyal guard, and put out her wrists for the chains, unasked, her face as smooth as ever, and only Ren, across the wreckage, understood that what she was watching was the most exhausted woman in the kingdom, finally putting down a lifetime of not asking questions, which left the Chancellor. Alistair Vane had not survived 30 years of court by fighting, and he was gone before Cassius hit the floor, out the servants' passage with a strongbox, and an escape 10 years in the polishing. Gremmed Gateman. A merchant barge waiting at the river stairs. A new name. Papers. Accounts in the east. It took him through the cellars, past the crates of his own patient poison, through the kitchen yards, to the royal stables, where the fastest horses in the kingdom stood saddled for ceremony. He chose the fastest. Of course he did. 30 years of taking the best of everything that belonged to the crown, and it had never once cost him. He came down the aisle with his box under his arm, and threw open the last stall on the row, and 1,700 pounds of the old king's warhorse, sent home from the hall bleeding and unsaddled ahead of the guards, turned around in the dark and looked at him. Fenwick, arriving 2 minutes too late with a squad of guards, described the scene simply, and never once, in all his years, agreed to elaborate. The stall door was open, the strong box had burst on the stones, and the animal who had stood over one murdered king was standing over the man who had helped murder him. The court records list the Chancellor's death as misadventure by horse. The stable records, in Fenwick's handwriting, say something else. They say, Onyx remembered, back in the wrecked Great Hall, with the blood moon still pouring red light through the broken glass, the wounded being carried out and the traitors being chained, Cale Ardentis climbed the dais one more time. The hall hushed. Everyone expected judgments, proclamations, the machinery of a crown restored. Instead, the Alpha King looked out at every assembled Alpha of every pack, and then looked down at an Omega in a torn prison shift with someone else's blood on her hands, and he said, "There is one piece of business left from the spring. Some months ago, this woman slapped my horse. I promised a response. Here it is." And the king of all wolves came down the steps and knelt on both knees, in front of 1,000 alphas, before the lowest-ranked wolf in the room. He said the 11 words back to her, the same 11, rebuilt. "You struck what is mine, so now all of it is yours." The hall did not cheer at first. It was too stunned to cheer. Then old Fenwick, standing on a bench with his one eye streaming, roared her name, and the dam broke, and the sound that came off 1,000 wolves shook dust from the rafters. She pulled the king of everything up by the collar, told him Omegas do not like being knelt at, and kissed him in front of the entire political structure of the werewolf world. The blood moon ceremony had been scheduled to end with a betrothal. It ended with one. Just not the one printed on the invitations. The weeks after a coup are paperwork with blood on it, and I will keep it short. But you deserve to know how the accounts settled. The trials ran a full month. The cellar crates held enough wolfsbane to kill a court twice over, and the ledgers found in the Chancellor's offices held the rest of the skeleton. Names, payments, a decade of small treasons feeding the large one. 11 officials fell with him, some to the block, most to the mines, and the steward with nothing to steward, the one who had carried a bundle into a bunk room at a bad hour, learned at his own trial that the witness who placed him there was a stable boy of 11 who testified in a voice that cracked twice and did not stop once, with the Luna-to-be sitting in his direct line of sight the whole time, and Fenwick's hand on his shoulder after. Alistair's seized papers unlocked the last of it, 10 years of it, and the kingdom finally learned the whole truth of the Red Winter, that the rogues had been hired, guided and led in through doors a chancellor held the keys to, all because the old king had been about to trim the mines and ministries that made small men rich. Cale read those pages alone in one sitting. Wren waited outside the door all night, and when he finally came out at dawn, he did not say anything. He just put his forehead down on her shoulder, and the man who had not wept since he was 19 stood there a long time. The dead had names again instead of a mystery. Sometimes that is what closure is. Not peace, just the truth, finally holding still. Blood Moon Pack was broken up, and its territories parceled to loyal neighbors. Lady Mayra, whose sideways warning Wren had not forgotten, testified fully against her father's men, coldly, completely, day after day, the most valuable witness the crown had, and was exiled rather than executed, sent to the far coast with her life and her silences. Wren went to see her the day she sailed, which surprised everyone, including Wren, and the two women stood on the dock for a few minutes, saying very little, and what Wren said at the end was, "Thank you," and what Mayra said was, "Kneel early, keep your head down, and look how well you listened." It was the only joke anyone ever heard her make. Alpha Garrick of Silvercrest was summoned south, expecting, perhaps, gratitude for his testimony. He walked into a throne room and found the Omega he had declined to defend sitting beside the throne. The law gave the new Luna wide latitude with a wolf who had abetted her framing. Half the court expected Silvercrest stripped and Garrick in chains, and there was an evening, I will be honest with you, when Wren sat alone with the order of accusation drafted in front of her and wanted it the way you want to press on a bruise. Fenwick found her there. He did not tell her what to do. He only asked her one question, whether she wanted to spend her first year as queen, becoming the kind of ruler the last chancellor could have worked for. Wren thought about it for a long week. Then she stripped him of nothing but his pride. He kept his pack. He lost his ward, formally, forever, and had to hear her say, from the days, that the family she was born needing had been here in the south all along, wearing an eye patch and smelling of hay. Garrick went home diminished in the only currency he had ever valued, and the story of the hearing traveled north faster than he did, the way such stories do. Ivy stayed. She came to Wren's chambers, finally said out loud what the dare had really been, 20 years of jealousy with wine on top, and about the courtyard silence, and about the long look through the bars, and she did not dress any of it up and did not ask to be forgiven, which is, if you think about it, the only apology worth anything. Wren told her about the letter, the one that had said nothing and been stolen to forge her death warrant, and asked why she had really written it, and Ivy said, because I could not say sorry and could not say nothing, and Wren said, I know, I kept it under my mattress. They sat with that a while. Wren let her stay for the coronation. Forgiveness came later, slowly, the way real forgiveness does, in seasons, in letters that gradually learned to say something. Fenwick was named master of the royal household over his own loud objections and lost every argument about it, because arguing with the Luna, as he told the grooms, was like arguing with weather. Cam was made a royal page, refused to give up his stable duties, and was permitted, by special dispensation that exists in writing with the royal seal on it, to keep both, which meant the future spymasters and stewards of the court spent years being politely corrected by a boy with hay in his boots. Sarah got a new infirmary and the right to overrule any physician in the fortress, which she exercised, in the years that followed, with terrifying joy. The rejection scars in both of them healed the way she had promised a completed bond heals, fully and with interest. The fevers became a story she told. The midnight stable visits did not stop. They just stopped being lonely. 2 figures now, most nights, 1 crown between them left on a fence post, feeding apples to a black stallion who had adjusted to being a national hero with total serenity. The coronation of the Luna Queen came with the next full moon, and every pack sent its alphas back to the same great hall, glass roof rebuilt, floors scrubbed of the last of it. She wore silver, which she found funny. The vows were spoken. The crown, the old queen's crown, recovered from the chancellor's burst strongbox on the stable floor, was set on the head of an orphan Omega from the northern border, while 1,000 alphas knelt. But that is not the picture the kingdom remembers. The picture the kingdom remembers came after, in the great courtyard, in front of everyone. Onyx was led out in full ceremony dress, the new blanket checked 3 times by Fenwick personally, and the crowd went quiet, because everyone knew the story by then. The whole kingdom knew. The new Luna walked up to the royal warhorse, 30 feet of open cobblestone, the same walk. She looked up at him. She raised her hand, that hand, and the great black stallion who had reared over her skull in the spring lowered his head, and she laid her palm soft against his flank, and he leaned into her like a door coming home to its frame. The king of all wolves stood beside them, not smiling, because he still saved those, but everyone close enough saw the corner of his mouth lose the fight. 1 slap. That is what started all of it. 1 arrogant girl, 1 reckless second, 1 hand cracking down on the 1 animal in the kingdom you must never touch. It should have ended her. Instead, it saved a king, unearthed a 10-year lie, and put a crown on the last wolf anyone would have chosen. The moon has a sense of humor. Kale said so himself. Thanks for staying with me on this one.